This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls, and this week Simon Phipps and I are talking with Guy Martin of Oasis Open about everything. So if you're bored about standards or even about open source, have no worries, because this one covers all kinds of things in great depth. Guy knows a lot, he's worked everywhere, and that is coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 644, recorded Wednesday, August 25th, 2021. Oasis Open. Hello again. Good morning, good evening, good whenever it is, wherever you are on Earth or elsewhere. I am Doc Searls, and this is FLOSS Weekly, and I am joined this time by the great Simon Phipps, who, for those of you with the right instrument, can actually see him smiling on a screen. How you doing,
Hi,
Simon?
Doc. Good to see you. I'm doing all right. It's here in the UK. It's only 22 degrees centigrade, so that's like freezing cold for you
75.
Californians. And it's the end of the afternoon. It's absolutely beautiful. I wish I was outside, but I'm really pleased to be with you and the guest, obviously.
Thanks. And I am in Bloomington, Indiana, where I heard it's going to be maybe over 100 degrees today, which is Fahrenheit, which is like 30 something, high 30s Celsius somewhere. Miserable with a high humidity as well. And in order to talk here, I just turned off the air conditioning because it makes noise in the basement where you see me. I'll be here. I'll be back in California next week for a couple of weeks, and then back here, and I don't know after that. So all that matters is that we're here on the internet, and our guest this week is Guy Martin of Oasis. And you know Guy, don't you, Simon, pretty well?
Yes.
I think at this point.
So Guy has done other things before. So we can ask him about some of those. But, yes, so he's only recently landed at Oasis, so we need to ask him what Oasis is. But the TLDR is that Oasis is a standards body that focuses particularly on standards for documents and data. And I've been working with them for many years. I was actually present at the meeting in the 90s where SGML Open renamed itself Oasis, and then
really?
we took
SGML.
We took the open document format to Oasis in the early 2000s and made it into an international standard there. So I've been working with Oasis for a long time. And so Guy and Oasis, I've got lots of contact points, and you'll have to tell me to shut up when I go.
You'll carry most of the water on this one, I'm sure. So let me let the listeners and viewers know that, and this is a kind of a wonderful little passage, that Guy Martin is a technologist, business strategist, and recovering engineer who used to write code for a living, but now just writes code and logic to annoy his family when the IoT in the house doesn't work. He spent the last half of his career helping companies understand and interface with open source and open standards, and is passionate about both of those communities, getting back to trusting each other the way they did at the dawn of the internet. The sun came up kind of slowly on that. It's an interesting. When was dawn? And where was she? Anyway, in his current role at Oasis Open, he's working to convince them to work together and play nicely. So welcome, Guy, here to the show. It's great to have you.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah,
great to see you. Great to be with you both.
And I just have to ask you up front. So I just saw what team helmet is that next to the rocket ship?
That is my
Atlas
fiance's. That is my fiance's school, University of Oregon Ducks. Go Ducks! When I moved here to be with her, they always say you get stopped at the border in Oregon and asked Oregon Ducks or Oregon State Beavers. And since I kind of needed to be in the right place, I had to declare Ducks. Yeah.
Well, I lived in North Carolina for many years, where my loyalty shifted depending on where I was working, from Carolina to Duke. And then I am now a Hoosier. I am at the university
Indiana.
here. And when I told them that I had been a Carolina or Duke fan, they looked at me in horror. So these things are taken seriously. So welcome to the show. So I can start before Simon gets to jumping on you with no doubt a lot of really good questions, better than I can come up with. when you said in your little bio there, getting people to trust each other the way they did at the dawn of the internet, did they ever? I don't know even who they is, because in many cases the theys are the same people in both cases.
Yeah.
Are there two hemispheres arguing with each other, or is it actually a real argument? I've always seen it as more like an emphasis.
Well, I don't know if I would consider it an argument, but I think back, if you look at everything that we're relying on to have this conversation, right? TCP/IP, all of the things that were the beginnings of the internet, they were a set of common agreed upon standards and they had open implementations. And I think what I have seen is maybe not arguments in the current world around open source and open standards, but two communities that tend to look at each other with a skeptical eye. And the reality is, I think there's a lot of value that can be brought with both of those communities beginning to trust each other a little bit more and beginning to learn from each other. I think that's really the important piece, right? I've spent the majority of my career in open source. And so I kind of came to Oasis, as Simon mentioned, a standards definition body with an open source perspective. And that was on purpose because they recognize that the open standards community has a lot to learn from open source in terms of doing things in a more iterative fashion, not trying to boil the ocean all and get every single use case sorted out from the beginning. And the open source community, I think, has some things to learn from the open standards community as well. Having an eye towards interoperability, having an eye towards stronger and more transparent governance in some cases. So I think there's room for both communities to learn from each other.
So, I have a couple of questions there, but I'll just start with this one. So I'm now involved actually with a working group at the IEEE, and at the same time, I've been, I've followed all of them in different ways, and I got involved with this new thing, this working group, now 2 years old, almost 2 years old, and we're going to go apply for another extension, and they're in part because they wanted to get more involved in what's open. They've always been, and I think a lot of standards organizations are more about, hey, this company is going to make a standard and they're going to own it and close it up and it's going to be theirs forever. And so they're trying to kind of move in a new direction, as they say in sports. So I'm wondering if you could, if you were going to talk about the ecosystem, I'm not even sure it would be an ecosystem, that's a term too often used, I think, of the different standards organizations, the W3C, ISO, OSI, IEEE, now Oasis. How do they fit? Do they even fit? Is there overlap between these things? And one reason I want to ask that is that there's an OSI guy on our working group, and I say this with complete respect. He's brought enormous complication to the process. So, right. And possibly deservedly so. I don't know.
Well, it's an interesting question because I think that you have a lot of those different bodies that have traditionally focused on different things. I mean, Simon's, talked about us focusing on data at the beginning, and that's still a little bit of our focus, although we've broadened that, right? You look at IEEE focused on hardware, you look at ITU focused on telecommunications. So there are places where those overlap, just kind of the natural way that the technology has evolved. But I think some of it, to me, is the difference in how they evolved from being, like you said, kind of maybe a more closed standards body, or a standards body where you got a bunch of companies got together with their proprietary implementations that came up with a standard so that they could interoperate, versus places like Oasis, which have kind of focused on getting everybody together, creating a standard that is open, that anyone can implement, right? And a standard that people other than the folks that were involved and first started it can come in and make contributions. So in essence, more like an open source model. So I think that, Oasis is one of those places that does that. I'd have to really stop. I mean, IEEE, is now doing that with our friend Salona at IEEE SA Open. So I think that you're starting to see those organizations begin to realize that openness is important for all the reasons that it's important in open source, right? Having a larger base of stakeholders, having a larger group of people who have valuable things to add, and really doing it in a way that is not organizations getting together, to create a private standard that it only benefits them. right? I think that's the main difference I see with some of these organizations. And it's not that they're bad; they've been there from the beginning, right? And some of these international standards bodies provide a lot of value, right? So I think it's really just a difference in culture and how they operate as foundations that are creating standards.
Right. Now, it's interesting to hear you talk about the spectrum of different standards bodies there, because so I've been representing OSI at a standards body called ETSI, which is a European standards body that focuses mostly on mobile telephony standards, and they're very much anchored in a world of standardization that uses a sequence of standardization where industry companies come together without any remuneration. They devise a standard from what they collectively regard as the best practice principles, and then they insert software patents and hardware patents into the standard, which the standards body then endorses them monetizing in production. And that universe of standards seems to me to be almost a completely different universe of standards to the universe of standards that I've seen at Oasis, where the sequence of standardization is that a company creates a market segment and typically its competitors drive the standardization process to take away the competitive advantage of the innovator. Do you think there is any scope for those two universes of standards to actually converge, or is that barrier of patent monetization going to keep them separate from each other forever?
That's a really great question, Simon, and I wish I had a crystal ball to answer that. I think that it's difficult. You've pointed out a great thing there, which is it's really difficult to get those two universes to work effectively together because of the patent, because of the direction they're taking on monetization, right? So, if we look at how open source works, right, where the monetization happens on top of building that common infrastructure. So the analogy I was thinking about, that I've used before is, if we all cooperate on building the highways and the street signs and kind of all those standard pieces, but the way we monetize is, either we build a Ferrari or we build a Yugo, right? Depending on what people's needs are. So I think that's a very different model than what you pointed out with using patents as the monetization point. And so, I don't know if you can get those two universes to work together effectively.
Right. So tell me a little bit about the open source work that you're doing at Oasis, because I know that you and Jamie Clark and an advisory board have been pioneering this idea of an open source incubator, so to speak, within Oasis. Tell me a little bit about that and your thinking behind it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's really why I came. I mean, a lot of folks, and I don't know if you were among them, Simon, in our open source community, kind of gave me this weird sideways glance when they heard I was going to be the executive director here at Oasis Open, because Oasis Open has traditionally been known as a standards body, right, as a standards definition organization. But really what they've kind of realized, probably even 2-3 years before I was offered this role, is that they needed to pivot and recognize that you needed to build some sort of open source incubator because, there's room for that. And if you look at an example of something we just did recently with the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, right? The Enterprise, the foundation that deals with enterprise Ethereum standards, they recognized that they had kind of a member-driven approach, and that a lot of their projects were, and a lot of things that were coming that wanted to get to standardization started out as open source, right? Started as an open source code base. And so by having a place where we can do that, where we can incubate that open source code, give it a lot of the strong and neutral and transparent governance models that we've traditionally had kind of from the standard side, but just enough, not too much, right? Not an overabundance of governance, but put us in a position where you can take a piece of open source code and run it through a standardization process without it being the traditional, what everybody thinks of as the 18-month, 2-year death march on standards, right? So being able to take a piece of open source code, abstract the API, the baseline project, for example, has done this baseline protocol project at Oasis, take the API out, use that as the bones of the standard, and then use that as something that you can get through to go through to an Oasis standard or a standard that we can take to a distributed body like ISO or ITU, for example.
So when I've heard that talked about in standards bodies, the old guard of standards people are very worried that the open source project becomes normative and that the standard just becomes documentation. Do you think that's the reality that you're looking at?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think if you look at baseline protocols, like I said, is a great example. Right now, it's Ethereum first. However, the reason those folks came to us and the reason they're putting this through a standard is they actually want multiple implementations, multiple code bases, being able to run on additional DLTs, right? They don't want it to solely be Ethereum only and forever. So I think that, with the right approach and thinking about, as you bring this project in, you're bringing it into a place like Oasis because when you want that standard to be created, you actually are encouraging multiple implementations. You want that to be something that is possible. Obviously, sure, Simon, it's always a concern, right? I mean, I think we saw this in the all-seen versus OIC or OCF nowadays, where, the all-seen approach to IoT was normative, single code base, where OIC and OCF were, a reference implementation plus a standard, plus, the desire to have multiple code bases and multiple implementations in different environments.
Right. So do you have any examples of projects and or standards that are symbiotically evolving at Oasis at the moment, or is that in your future?
I think that, like I said, the baseline protocol is a great example of that, one of the open projects that we have. And, we did a partnership mentioned with the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, specifically to take what was the Oasis Ethereum open project and put it under the umbrella of the EEA, so that as the EEA has their members coming in and saying, hey, we have some open source pieces that we want to start around, Ethereum technologies, that they can do those and have those go through to standardization as well. So I think that, we're at the initial stages of this, but we're kind of on the cusp of having that become something that is going to be valuable going forward.
Now, one of the concerns that people have had about open source work being done at standardization bodies is that standards setting is a very expensive game. You have to spend a lot of staff time. You have to engage in a lot of otherwise unnecessary travel. You have to share your thinking with competitors and potentially be predated by them. Do you really think there is any place for the traditional free software developer in the world of standards, or is this the repurposing of open source by big corporates?
So, I knew you were going to ask me that, Simon. I was actually prepared for that. So I think that, the thought that free and open source is going to be the only thing that goes forward going forward. I think the reality, and sorry to your listeners, is that that's most of the work that happens today is somewhere in between. I used to say Bill Gates, now Larry Ellison, pick somebody, on the far right, and everybody on the left. The majority of the work that happens somewhere in the middle. And so I think that that's going to continue to happen. And I don't see the standardization efforts that we're trying to do. I used to think standards was, bureaucratic, all got to travel, sit in the back, smoke-filled room and come up with a standard. That is not what we're trying to do at Oasis. And I think it's not what Oasis has been about really from the beginning. It's been about more of that collaborative approach, that was closer to open source, was a little more focused on policy-driven things and actually getting things out there that could be used by a wider branch of folks. But, the reason I wouldn't have come here if I didn't think that the model for open source and the way open source works and the collaborative nature of how open source works was not going to be able to fit into the standards world, right? In the standards world that Oasis is part of. I just wouldn't have come. It wouldn't have been a good career move. But I think we are at a place where that can happen. Is it going to be easy? No, it's not going to be easy, right? Just as we have, fights, disagreements, whatever in open source and things get forked. I hope that doesn't happen in standards, but I think that sometimes we have a lot to learn in standards about the way that open source is able to work effectively and have, different stakeholders come together. And really, when I think about how you work open standards communities with open source communities, it's finding a place to do those checkpoints. It's finding a place to say, and we did this with OIC and now OCF, Open Connectivity Framework. We did this where we kind of had points where we had to stop and say, okay, where is this? What's leading, right? Is the standard currently ahead? Is the open source implementation currently ahead? And figure out how we negotiate where those things are. To me, those are the important things in doing this, right? Is recognizing that this is hard and recognizing that you actually have to be intentional about making these checkpoints as to where you are in the process between open source and open standards.
Right. So we've got a lot of people tune into FLOSS Weekly who are individual developers. They have day jobs.
Yep.
Do you think there is any way that they would be able to be involved in any of the activities that are happening at Oasis? Because, I mean, you do charge a membership fee to participate. So
that's a great
big
point.
Barrier to entry.
No, it's a great point, Simon. So the thing with open projects, yes, there are sponsorships, and the companies that sponsor are members, but they're open source projects. Anybody can participate without being a member. That's actually a really, really important thing. I'm glad you brought that up, because we don't charge. We have individual memberships if people want to be members of Oasis, but you don't have to be a member to contribute to one of these open source projects that can later become part of the standard. So you can make contributions. Now, there are licensing things, individual CLAs that you would need to sign, but you don't have to be a member to actually participate as an individual developer.
I'm wondering, I'm looking back at all of the things that you've been involved with, and mostly corporate. You worked at, just looking down the list here, Autodesk, Samsung, Sun Microsystems, CollabNet.
Don't forget Red Hat. Red
Hat's there, Samsung's there. CollabNet was a small company, and I imagine you may have been involved with more startups as well. I'm wondering if you can see trends. I mean, I look back, 20, 25 years. I mean, open source didn't even become a commonly used word until 1998, which used to be recent, is now ancient history, but still, it's within a generation. And I'm wondering how business has changed, how Microsoft is now one of the biggest, open source outfits out there. They're really caring about it, and I think they're sincere about it. Because they have to be, and
right. It's a business requirement.
It's a business requirement, and so I'm wondering if not just with open source, but in respect to pretty much everything that's happening, especially now, the pandemic has thrown hiring, has thrown work into a whole new. A whole new format where there's a lot of people are working at home. Offices are empty.
Right.
They say there's only 80% occupancy in Manhattan. I think it's much lower than that at this point. And I think that's an optimistic number. A lot of people are working from home. So, and that actually favors, developing types, that always work at home anyway. So, and I think it's also raised the level that individuals are now involved, just in their own lives, and also determining what corporate culture is, to the degree it exists. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how things have evolved over the years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll use an example from Samsung. When I was the senior strategist there, you probably know my friend Ibrahim Haddad. I mean, may have even been on your show. Started that open source program office, and I was his second hire. And we worked through what the corporate culture was and how you enabled an open source program office. And I know that was an organization that viewed every engineer at every level as fungible, right? Oh, okay, you're at this level, I can replace you with another engineer at this level. It was a big culture shock for them, for us to say, hey, these maintainers that we're hiring, that you want to do work on your behalf, and so that you have a say, meritocracy, you have a say in what goes on, they're not fungible, right? They're highly employable. And I think that's even more the case that now that you mentioned, Doc, with the pandemic, but I don't think it's really changed that much, at least for open source developers. Really strong open source developers, maintainers, high level contributors have always been able to move and work on the same project, right? And this was a culture shift that we had to kind of help Samsung get their minds around, which was, hey, I just can't. If we had at one point the subsystem maintainer for the video parts of the kernel, and he was looking to potentially leave because he was unhappy, and we were trying to sort that out. And corporate's response was, oh, we'll just hire another one. We're like, no, you don't get it. There's one of him. Right now, in some open source projects, it's not that 1-to-1 ratio, but I think you still, if you're a good developer, the pandemic hasn't changed the fact that a good open source developer, pandemic hasn't changed the fact that you can be employed anywhere. Who signs your check is independent of the project that you're working on, right? And I know, Simon, our friend Denise Cooper, has said this about even folks like us who don't write code anymore, but work on, in the business and strategy area, that our first job is working for the open source community. And our second job is whoever happens to be writing our checks at that point. And I think it's important because it's a sense of us as individuals helping move the open source world forward for the benefit of everybody, right? For the benefit of those individual developers, and figuring out a way to have that balance point. I think it is a challenging balance point sometimes, because when you're working in a corporate environment, you're sometimes asked to do things where you're like, oh, is that the best for the community? Well, no, it isn't. And at that point, you have a choice to make. Do you continue down that path, or do you go somewhere else that's going to continue to pay you to work in open source, but let you actually move the open source community forward?
I remember when Dan Fry was running IBM's division, whatever it was called, I think it was in Portland at the time. Mm-hmm. And he was there a long time. And I remember him telling me that it took IBM 6 years to discover that they couldn't tell their open source maintainers that happened to work for them, what to do. That, in fact, it was the other way around. And
exactly.
And your fungibility point is a really important one, because companies tend to think, especially big ones, tend to think in terms of org charts and hierarchies, mm-hmm. and replaceable parts and shrinkage, and there are all these terms that are used for talent that comes and goes. And there's an assumption that these people are replaceable. And what gets forgotten, and I think it's something that open source relies utterly on, is that all of us as human beings are different by design. We look different, we sound different. Two identical twins could be, have the same DNA and be remarkably different human beings. And we're all original, and that's another thing. And we bring originality to what we do, and companies need that. And that's that's one of the things I wonder about, are companies giving that more respect? I mean, Dan said it took IBM 6 years to figure that out, but I think it was a practical thing that they figured out, which is these guys are clearly adding value that we can't even see, and the whole world is depending on it, so we better keep them on board. It's, right. What's good for the world is good for us, and we're on that boat, and we're all going to work on this together. And I've talked to people at Oracle who said the same thing, and Red Hat, of course, started there. But I'm sort of wondering, I want to look at the vector here. Is this pointing in a direction that is going to result in a sort of a different kind of company in the future?
So I think about companies that started in the internet age, right? The Facebooks, the Twitters, others. I think they're already a different generation ahead of like a Samsung or even an Autodesk, right? In terms of understanding that point, that these are valuable resources. It's beneficial for us to keep them happy. And we need to find a way to keep them happy while still meeting business goals, but that they aren't fungible, and that if they choose to leave, they're going to continue to work on that open source project. Yeah, we may get a benefit as a company from that, but we have lost a voice, right? We have lost the ability to have an influence in that project unless we've brought somebody else up who's going to be making those same level and types of contributions. And so I think, organizations need to think about that. They need to consider how they meet their business goals while keeping those developers who are making valuable contributions on their behalf happy. And it's not easy, right? I mean, again, I'll use the example of Samsung. It was a challenge to get the corporate culture to understand that. I mean, I think they're there now, but it just kind of depends on what kind of company it is. So to your point, Doc, I think companies kind of that have started sort of born natively in the open source and internet age, understand that, right? Or at least they have a leg up on companies that have been around a long time, who have now had to adjust to a, primarily proprietary world, to a world where open source is the core of everything, right? I mean, I tell people all the time, right? We joke, we say open source is one, and it has. Obviously not on the desktop, but everywhere else. This is just the reality that new companies that are starting now sort of recognize. This is how they add value on top of what's already built as open source, and that I don't think you could find a single angel investor now who would back something where the founders said, "Well, we want to build everything soup to nuts. We want to build an operating system. We're going to." They just look at you like you were crazy. Right. So I think organizations now it is trending that way, where they recognize that these open source developers are critical to actually their business.
So there's something that matters on the standards side, and it's a term that's come up a lot lately. It's been around for a long time, but in terms of how things work in the marketplace, and that's substitutability. Mm-hmm. In other words, I can. I'm looking in the background here for people who can see it. There are two different radios there, and they're substitutable. I can get rid of one and use the other, and they're substitutable products. And likewise, even with open code, there are lots of Linux distributions out there, and there may be a little hassle in moving from one to another, but it's done all the time. It's not that hard to do. Yet most companies traditionally have wanted to lock customers in, have wanted to lock people mm-hmm. into something that's proprietary. It isn't necessarily because it's proprietary, but because it's better. In fact, sometimes it's better is enough. And I'm wondering if that term has come up more for you, or if that's something you see sort of advancing in the future. Because I think that's what customers want. It's not just a matter of having choice. Choice is I think it's kind of a improperly loaded word, because it assumes that your choice is always what somebody else provides rather than what you can do as an independent entity,
right?
Which is more like agency or volition or some other word. But it's good for business in general if your stuff is simply better, but it is substitutable. You can use another one, whatever that other one right. happens to be. And I'm wondering to what extent that kind of thinking plays in the standards world, because as we're, you and Simon were talking about earlier, especially with some standards bodies, the idea is that you do want to get companies locking people in.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that, if I was going to go to a standards body coming from the open source world, right, this is why I came to Oasis, because the focus is on that substitutability. And if you look at some of the places that Oasis has done work, especially in Europe, where you are, Simon, the reality is that governments for example, and other highly regulated industries, but let's talk about governments for a second, have this desire to not have that lock-in, right? To not have the single code base to rule them all, but the ability to say, hey, 5 years down the road, if I want to switch this out with another implementation, or if my needs change, right, I can build it myself internally. If I've got the IT staff, I can contract it out somewhere else. And if there is the standard around that, I think that is what they're looking for, right? And it's one of the things that, the other thing when I looked at coming to Oasis is the recognition that they had a good reputation with these government bodies that were looking at standards. Yes, it's a checkbox in procurement, but there's a reason that it's a checkbox. It's that protection and that substitutability that you talked about, Doc.
So I have a question about lock-in and government. I spent a lot of time in Europe before COVID. A million miles of flying back and forth to Europe. Saw Simon on site in the flesh in Southampton a couple times. And for a long time, there was this sense between all the governments, and I think ISO as well, not ISO, maybe it was ISO, that the internet was actually a bad thing for the telcos, and the telcos kind of ran the governments to a large degree. The PPTs is what they were called over there. in some ways had more power than the prime minister in some ways. And what happened and the way that manifested in respect to the internet is that your cell phone, your mobile phone, was locked into that country, and you were going to pay a big tariff at the border. And that persisted for a long time and was considered even a good thing, because the government's got a piece of that. You're in, Strasbourg or something, and you're talking from France to Germany. You don't mean to be, but suddenly you're paying a big tariff at the border, and because governments understood that borders were a good thing, and therefore the internet was a bad thing, because the internet was inherently borderless, even if you could do a kind of reverse IP lookup thing. So I'm wondering if anything's changed in respect to that. When did governments get the clue? Who gave them that clue that, geez, it's going to be a hell of a lot better for everybody if we're not worrying about getting socked with some big fees as we've gone from, across the borders from one state to another, something you experience in Europe constantly, but you don't in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Doc. And I don't know. I don't have a magical time where I can pinpoint, hey, this is when it changed. I know that, if you look back in some of the work that I've done, I was at Motorola for a while. I just remember, I remember it used to kind of be the tail wagging the dog, where we would put together, I was part of a group that would test new phones, for example. And, I'd find a bug in something, and I'd file a bug in the beta test, and they would close it as, works as designed for the customer, where the customer wasn't the end user, where the customer was the carrier, right? The cellular carrier. Yeah. And so it was very much the tail wagging the dog. And, and I have to say, say what you will about Steve Jobs and Apple and the iPhone was the thing that kind of broke that, right? It was the sell directly to the end user, have the end user demand certain things of the carrier, right? And that notion of the carrier being anything but a big fat dumb pipe, right? The carrier having their own app store and everything else, that got broken, right, really by iPhone. And then, of course, Android came along and helped that as well. But I think that was, for me, the beginning of when, government started to realize, there's so much demand by the actual end users, not the carrier as the end user, that, organizations had to change that approach. And governments, I think, had to change that approach at that point.
So to change tack a little bit there, so you and I both worked at Sun Microsystems for a while. I think we were even there at the same time, Guy.
I think we overlapped by about that much.
Yeah, by a couple of years. So you worked on Java Car, I think.
I worked on Java Car. That was actually still one of my favorite technical projects ever in my entire career.
Right. So it's very interesting looking at that, because you and I both did work on what eventually became open source Java, and to celebrate that, my T-shirt today is the launch T-shirt.
Oh, the Duke! Yay!
Yeah, so that's the
Duke Lips.
Intergalactic Duke that you have there, and one of the things that came out of the work that we did there was this lawsuit between Oracle and Google that stands to make life very complicated for standards bodies like Oasis in the future, because it's left uncertain whether or not other parties standardizing an API is actually going to be an IP infringement. What steps is Oasis taking to protect itself from the API IP Armageddon that might be coming up?
And this is where I would need to have Jamie Clark or General Counsel on to give you a complete answer to that. I think that, what we've tried to do at a high level, right? Simon, that our open projects efforts use one of 7 OSI approved licenses. And I know you were part of that. So there's that piece of it. And then kind of from the IP piece of the standard side, really what we've said is, if it follows the open source license, you're good. Now, obviously, there's the patent piece that you brought up earlier could be a potential issue going forward. But, I think that really the approach we've tried to take is, do it mostly as the open source side, and then a very thin layer of whatever else may be needed for the protection of IP kind of from the standards piece. And like I said, I wish I had Jamie here to give you a more complete answer to that. I know we've been looking at it, and I know our approach has generally been to treat most of that as kind of the open source license, and then whatever thin layer we have to have potentially for the standards piece.
Right. It's an area where I think that the other universe, where the standards essential patents come in, is much better protected against the copyrightable APIs, because they go through the requirements-led approach to developing standards. And the world that Oasis is in has got more of a problem there, I think, because you're typically following into a market that's been made by a market leader who often isn't part of the standards body.
Right. Okay. Now I understand your thing about Etsy and SCP, right? Because that's the model you talked about, where they deal with it by actually inserting standards in kind of inserting patents into the standard to get the enforceability and the monetization that way. Yes.
Okay. I do have a paper on that, if you're interested, that I wrote for Open Forum Europe. And
cool.
I'm absolutely. Pretty sure Jamie can send you a copy.
I always read your stuff, Simon. I liked your gardening analogy one. That was actually really good.
Yes, I'm just looking at the blueberry bushes that was written about are just outside the window over there. So, Java Car. You say that was the best thing that you ever did?
Absolutely, still the most fun.
I was always fascinated by Sun's approach there to openness. Do you think that there are still lessons to learn from the way that Java was made open but not open source for the evolution as we go forward into the future, where we're worried about ethical licensing, and where we're worried about licensing of things that are widely distributed on networks? Are there still lessons to learn?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we were there when there was a lot of discussion about Java being open but not open source. And Java Car, right? So those that don't know, we took a GM EV1 first production electric car, ripped out all the carpet, laid down Ethernet cable. Yeah, it was a little bit kludgy. Put the carpet down so it didn't look so bad. But we really focused, I think, on taking an inner source approach. Before I think we really even coined the term inner source at that time, or maybe Tim O'Reilly had just coined it. But that car, that project, the all of the stuff that is kind of common in telematics now. So all the stuff that Tesla has done, were initial stuff that we did in that car at that point. But we took an inner source approach in that. I think at the end of the day, there were something like 20 different people at Sun that contributed code, in addition to my small team contributing code to what went into that car. And so, I think that was a great lesson in the power of that collaboration and the power of opening up. We didn't, our little small Skunkworks team in Sun Labs did not say, we're going to own this and we're going to be the only ones that contribute code. We kind of went out to JavaSoft, went out to other places in Sun and said, hey, does anybody want to help us and work on this? And showed what the value is for that. Unfortunately, as you said, Simon, it didn't translate into Sun doing a better job of actually making Java open source, which I think would have potentially, had a lot of different impacts than what Java ended up as.
Yes. Well, there were many lessons to learn there. I'm really pleased that we managed to get OpenJDK out before the Oracle pulled the walls down. Because otherwise we would have had a much worse future ahead of us, I think.
Yeah.
So you were also at Samsung, and it's very tempting to ask you, how you feel about Samsung's use of Linux Foundation to attempt to standardize Tizen. Do you think there are lessons to learn from that debacle?
Remember, I was there when Tizen started. I was actually part of the group that worked very closely with Intel. And it's funny because my fiance's at Intel, and we met long after the Tizen situation, and so we have the war wounds around that. I think that again, that was a cultural thing with Samsung where I had arguments with up to VP levels, VP JD Choi actually, around when he said, "Oh, well, Tizen is open source because the code's available." I'm like, that doesn't make it open source, right? The code is available, but it takes a Herculean effort to get a pull request in that doesn't come from Samsung or Intel. That's not an open source community. And I think that was just a lesson that they had to kind of learn, that wasn't an approach that, I mean, I always said Tizen was a great platform between Intel and Samsung. It was not an open source project. And it wasn't, and the code, there's a very big difference between source available, as you know, Simon, and an open source community. Mm-hmm. And I think Samsung sort of learned that lesson in the sense that, it's still a great platform for them, but it is not a burgeoning, thriving open source project. And I think I said at the top of the show for listeners that were there that, they've gone to Android Wear on the watch. One of the reasons they've gone to Android Wear, I would imagine, is a wider ecosystem of apps, right? And a wider ecosystem of people that can actually, contribute to that operating system, as opposed to Tizen, which became, an Intel Samsung thing.
Right. Now, well, one of the things that always interested me about Tizen, that maybe you can answer for me, is that Linux Foundation took it on and allowed it to be a open source project that was in the Linux Foundation. How did that happen?
Yeah.
Why did they ever allow that?
Well, I'm not going to speak for Jim, right? And Jim and I have known each other for a long time. I don't know why they did that. That's a question you would have to ask him. I think that, though, knowing the people at the Linux Foundation, I think they thought that they could sort that out and make it a true open source project. And it just even the best foundations, right? If something came to Oasis and it looked like it was supposed to be open and then it ended up not being, we'd have to make that call around, hey, it just didn't end up being as open as we wanted it to be. But I think the main fault in that there kind of lies with the two main protagonists, Intel and Samsung, about the fact that they just weren't culturally ready and at a point where they could make it open. And unfortunately, I'll point the finger a little more at my former colleagues at Samsung, because I think Intel had OTC, right, had a mod in the Open Source Technology Center at the time. And I think talking to the colleagues there, they were frustrated that it couldn't be fully open. It was mainly the cultural piece where Samsung was at a point in their evolution that they're better at it now. But at that point where they equated open to the code being available. And that was just kind of a learning that they had to get over that hump of just making the code available does not make it open source.
So I'd like to stay a little bit on the Linux Foundation, because the Linux Foundation, I think, has a model that we haven't seen before, where you have they're kind of this United Nations within which paying companies can collaborate in a zillion different ways. And they sort of pick these umbrellas and they move into an area, the cell phone world with the cloud computing foundation and blockchain with Hyperledger. We've had a number of their folks on the show. And it seems to me they've changed the ecosystem a good deal. And I'm wondering if that's had an effect. You talked a bit about open source, but on the open standards world, or on the standards world in general, or just what your thoughts are about the Linux Foundation and its role in the world that we have now.
Yeah. As I mentioned, Jim and I have known each other for years. I was there when I was at Autodesk, helped the Linux Foundation get together with the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences and start the Academy Software Foundation. So, I was kind of there at the beginning of that. And, the United Nations is a great analogy. They've done a lot for the ecosystem, right? I think that where we tend to differ maybe a little in what we approach in Oasis is that we tend to be a little bit more around the policy and around being what I would call nimble and a little bit closer to the customer, right? The Linux Foundation is huge. And so, they tend to have that environment where they bring something in and it's a little more marketing driven, which is great, right? You need that. We tend to focus, I think, a little bit more on the governance piece, a little bit more on sort of incubating open source pieces and sending them through standards, even though I know the Linux Foundation has a standards track now with the JDF work. But I think we're trying to be more about what it looks like to be an environment that brings open source and open standards together in this harmonious way and is not about kind of turning a crank to get a standard through.
There's a little noise in the back channel about inner source, which is actually a term I hadn't heard. If I'd heard, I'd forgotten it already. So maybe you could tell us what that means and where that plays. I don't really know.
Sure. That actually came, and Simon can correct me, but I believe Tim O'Reilly coined that term. Gosh, when was it? 80s somewhere, of using open source methodologies within an organization's firewall, right? So building, open source style projects that everyone in a group contributes to. The classic example is, something that, is a library that every product in your organization relies on, right? And you run that as an open source project, but inside the wall, inside your firewall and inside your network, where you're having multiple teams contribute to that and run that, as opposed to having, a libraries team that's working on it.
So the work you're doing with open source communities at Oasis, just to close the circle on that, what do you think is going to happen next? I'm seeing in this world a lot of competition for your activity. Our mutual friend Salona has started an incubator at IEEE. There's discussion at other de jure standards bodies about open source work. We see Linux Foundation has basically acquired a standards body so they can submit international standards themselves without needing to use a standards body. How is this all going to settle out? Are we going to see some consolidation in the world of standards?
It's a good question. I think that just acquiring a standards body, right, doesn't necessarily get you 100% of the way there. And I didn't think I really recognized this until I got to Oasis and looked at all of the reputational work and all of the work from a governance standpoint that lets Oasis take an Oasis standard and submit it to ISO or ITU or ANSI or other de jure bodies. And so that reputation, that ability for these other bodies to trust the governance process that we have, is not easily replicatable, right? And so I think that one of the things that I wanted to see at Oasis, and it's one of the things I was most happy about when we did this Enterprise Ethereum Alliance deal, which I'll talk about as the example, was the ability for somebody like Oasis to provide that standardization expertise and to provide that ability to take something and make it a standard for a piece of open source that maybe wasn't necessarily hosted with us, right? I think that's kind of an important thing. So we jokingly at some point called it standards as a service, but it was more than that. So the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance came to us and said, hey, we have these member-led standards, which are open, but they're kind of defined by members coming together who have, in some cases, proprietary implementations, and they want to have things work together in the Ethereum ecosystem. But then they had a lot of folks coming to them and saying, hey, we've got open source code, or we're starting up a project or an effort or a proof of concept to test something, and it's open source, and we want that to be able to be standardized as well. And organizations like the EEA said, well, we don't have that capability in-house. So how do we go out? It's a build versus buy decision. And they came to us and said, hey, would you partner with us on this with the notion of creating a larger big tent ecosystem for Ethereum enterprise standards? And we said, absolutely, that makes complete sense. So, it's called, and for us, it's called the Managed Open Project. So it's a little bit different than our traditional open project. It's kind of this more white label, if you will. And I think that kind of ability to have people partner together is going to be really, really important. Now, some of the big players are still going to go and build their own thing. But I think you've got these smaller foundations in petroleum and real estate and others that need this capability and want to continue to exist and have their membership, driven the way it is, but they need the ability to do these kinds of de jure standards. And I think finding a way to collaborate on that is really important. And it's kind of one of the reasons, again, why I came to Oasis, is because I saw an opportunity for us to partner and potentially, who knows, there could be a partnership with Linux Foundation in the offing at some point. And I've talked to Jim and said, hey, we're willing to talk and do that, because I think you made a great point, Simon, is having every little individual vertical, foundation based on a particular vertical technology space go and do that themselves is not going to be the path forward to success.
I have a kind of a slightly off the wall question about the advantage of having an entity not know what you're doing. And I'm thinking in this case, in one case, an obvious one you brought up, I think is really important, is what Steve Jobs' long game was with mobile phones. And he first got AT&T in the U.S., but then the demand grew so much it it changed the whole world. Earlier, it happened with the web, and when some high-energy physicists went to the PTTs in Europe, and not just from CERN with Tim Berners-Lee, but the Weizmann Institute in Israel, and I forget the name of it, in Italy, and SLAC in the U.S., and said, hey, we'd like to look at each other's documents, but we'd kind of like to use this protocol here, TCP/IP, rather than paying for X25 or something that's billable. And the phone company said, sure. That was a Trojan horse, right? That brought the whole world in, not just, a few soldiers. That was like, we're bringing the entire world in on this thing, and it's going to change everything. And they fought it at first, but in the long run, it was to their advantage. And I'm wondering if you see anything like that laying around in the world today, or that might happen in the world today, without giving up any secrets, if you even have any. But it seems to me we're sort of overdue for another one of those that will just upset everything, but in a really good, constructive way. Linux,
it's
sure. Thinking about that, and open source in general was that. Yeah,
Linux was that. Open source is that. I'm trying to think if there's a really big market that, and I think it's tougher now than it used to be, right? I mean, the obvious case of something that everybody used but that was sort of closed and not kind of available and open. And I mean, we got phones, maybe appliances. I don't know, right? I mean, maybe IoT. Although I think that IoT is kind of an interesting one, and you heard it in my bio, right? I mean, I have an IoT system in the house that drives my family crazy, but I think that there are a lot of standards in that space. There are closed ecosystems like Apple's, Apple Home Kit and others, but I don't think that from the perspective of something that's easy for the consumer IoT, right? I mean, I think kind of the enterprise or industrial IoT is a lot farther along in this, in some of these standards, although you could argue that SCADA and others for energy are still having issues. But, I think that it's difficult, right? I mean, my fiance will tell you that it's that the amount of effort I've put into our IoT system and the amount of wrangling I've had to do of kind of Z-Wave standard, Zigbee standard, how do you make all these things work together? And ostensibly all these switches and hardware that we have that are Z-Wave and Zigbee are standards, and they are, but it's still really difficult to actually make a functioning IoT system without a lot of deep technical knowledge. And my fiance will tell you that I've put 2+ years of effort into this, and it's still not right. And some of that has to do with ironically the hardware implementation of our sensors, based on Z-Wave, that not Z-Wave's fault, but just other things that the sensors have done incorrectly from a firmware standpoint. So I think, to me, that's an interesting area where is there something that can come along and really democratize that area and make it simple enough for someone who is technical but not an engineer to build a functioning IoT system. I think that would be an interesting area.
Yeah, I think IoT is exactly where the internet was when all of us were on CompuServe and Prodigy and those things. I mean, they're all
AOL, AOL.
AOL, of course. We don't have the Internet of Things. We've got the Apple and the Google and the Amazon of things, and that's not the internet. Right. I'm sorry. They may rely on the internet, but it's not really. And and in fact, I think but it's not a Trojan horse yet because nobody's dragged it into any company. Phil Windley was here a few months ago talking about Picos, and Picos are just a way that anything, whether it's a smart or not, can have its own instantiation and its own address, and it's programmable. And it's laying around at BYU in Utah, and almost nobody's using it, and it's brilliant. If I were half my age, I would start a company based on that tomorrow. But that's kind of what you need, I think, though. But that's actually like a bit of open code that's laying around. There's another one with identity called Keri, Keri, and there's a lot of work being done in SSI, self-sovereign identity, that could have that. But there are a lot of companies are involved in that, but nothing's caught on yet. In part because getting the UI right is like the hardest thing. And Steve Jobs got the UI right. I mean, in a way, that's what happened. I mean, there were smartphones. I had a Nokia smartphone. I was like, get a series of Nokia smartphones, and they didn't have Wi-Fi on them. Well, My friend in Europe has one that has Wi-Fi on it, and it was exactly what you said earlier. Well, our customers wouldn't want that, and the customers were corporate, not you and me. And but anyway, it's just a thought there. I would get your thoughts on.
Well, I mean, I think IoT is an interesting space, right? I mean, in our house, I am running Habitat, which is a Linux-based local hub. It's kind of, I look at it as if you look at OpenHab, right, which is the open source thing that'll run on Raspberry Pi 4s, which I have a bunch of in my network closet here. You can do OpenHab, you can do Habitat, you can go all the way to Smart Things, right? The Samsung, and I was at Samsung when we bought Smart Things. And, I think that nobody has gotten that UI right. Habitat hasn't got that UI right. OpenHab is very, engineering culture, which is great. And I love it. And I've used it. I chose Habitat because it kind of is a step between that pure, engineering geekery and Smart Things, which tries to do the UI right, but really locks you into a lot of things. And so, yeah, you're right. And I haven't even touched Apple HomeKit. I just didn't want to be part of that. But finding a way to bring something in that hits that sweet spot of meeting the UI requirements and making it easy, right? Because Smart Things sort of had the approach of, hey, grandma can do automation. Well, no, right? I mean, there's still so much, like you said, there's the Amazon world, there's the Apple world, then there's this world of everything that's a standard device that uses either Zigbee or Z-Wave or sometimes, Wi-Fi. And there's just nothing. OIC, or Open Connectivity Framework, was an attempt by Samsung and Intel to have that abstraction layer for developers where you didn't have to care what the networking layer was underneath, and you could write your apps to that. Just hasn't taken off as much as it should have. So I think that it's interesting, that consumer IoT market is right for somebody to come along and actually build something that that really truly interfaces with kind of both of those ecosystems, because the Apple ecosystem and the Amazon ecosystem and the Google ecosystem are kind of not going away. And I know that Google's got Thread and they've got some other things that they're working on to try to make this more seamless, but it just isn't seamless right now.
I'm pretty convinced that that's waiting for IPv6 to take over at the consumer level. Because I don't know if you've seen, there's an open source project called LibreCast that's run by a guy called Brett Sheffield, where what he's done is he's created a very simple open source library that lets you do IP multicast over IPv6. And once people are able to rely on IPv6 being present, I have a feeling that it's going to become much easier to have IoT devices and many other classes of activity happening peer-to-peer over the internet without requiring a gatekeeper to do the NAT traversal for you, without requiring some kind of central service to do the registration and marriage brokering between devices. Right. So that would be my candidate for Trojan horse, I think.
It'd be interesting because
multicast.
And I'd be interested to see sort of how that would work with a local hub of some sort to run the applications, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons I chose Habitat over Smart Things, is that all the things run locally, right? I mean, the issue I had with Smart Things is, okay, it had to do a cloud round trip. And there wasn't really an open source sort of developer ecosystem, which there is with Habitat and obviously with OpenHab, because it's purely open source. Yeah. But that notion of local execution was a huge piece of this, and actually having a community of developers that would build things, build open source things for it.
So tell me, Guy, I know that you're a radio amateur. Would you say that being a ham has made you like open source, or liking open source has made you a radio ham?
I think liking open source has made me a radio ham. Although the way I actually got into ham radio was when I lived in California. I spent 10 years as a volunteer at CAL FIRE, the state fire department. And I got involved in CAL FIRE from being involved in the community emergency response team, which did a lot of, and this was right after 9/11 is really when I got into this. And that kind of open collaborative nature of that community with CERT, and I saw a lot of radio people at the time, and I was involved in open source, and I went, oh, well, seems like a very natural fit. It's a group of people who are very much in the open source ethos and who want to help each other, and who build interesting, cool, quirky things to do, video transmission over, unlicensed radio waves, right? Or spectrum that's licensed, not unlicensed, spectrum that's specifically licensed for amateur radio. And so I kind of got involved in it at that point, and that led to, again, me being involved with CAL FIRE as a radio communications person for 10 years. So yeah, still love it. And I think you're right. It's a very close analogy to people who like open source tend to also like amateur radio.
Wow. And I was WV2VXH way back in the early 60s. And but then I flunked my code test 3 times in a row. The last 2 times I'm missing a space because my handwriting was terrible. Then I got sent away to school for academic correction, and it was the end of it. But that was, that informed everything I've done since, by far. I think being a ham may have been the most important technical thing in my whole life. So I think that's true for a lot of people. Right. So we always close with 4 questions, which you try to answer briefly. The first, is there anything we haven't asked that you'd like us to have asked before we get out of here? And you can answer quickly.
I think the one thing that I did that you sort of didn't ask, but I answered, is why I came to Oasis, right? Why did an open source person come to a standards body? And I think there's just a natural opportunity here. And I saw it as the ability to kind of bring all the things that we love about open source to a community that really is in need of it, and I think really has an opportunity to make a difference.
Well, it's Oasis. Good luck to have you there, and it's an ours to have you on the show. Anything to say about blockchain quickly? You mentioned Solona, who came over from Hyperledger.
Right. I mean, I think blockchain is very interesting, right? Obviously, but in some ways, it's the hype cycle that what cloud used to be. Everything is blockchain. The answer, what's the question? Well, the answer is blockchain. And I think that, it's a little bit tongue in cheek. I think there's a lot of value to be had in blockchain. I look at projects like we have at Oasis, the baseline protocol, which really quickly is the ability to synchronize state data into private blockchains, but using the public mainnet, in this case, public Ethereum mainnet. Technologies like that let you utilize blockchains in a way that don't expose private data are going to be interesting, and having it be blockchain agnostic is going to be really, really important, which is why I'm excited that the baseline's here and is building a standard that's going to allow that to run on Hyperledger and other DLTs.
Yeah, Marshall McLuhan, before he died in 1980, said of computing that it's only about memory. Memory is everything. And I was thinking of the hype cycle that early on, when it was all hardware, it was ROM and RAM and drives, and then it became about databases, and now it's about blockchain, which is, by the way, a database, right?
Right.
So
exactly.
By different names and different iterations, it kind of goes through that cycle. Okay, the last 2 questions. What are your favorite text editor and scripting language?
I'm still a VI guy, and I know all the Emacs people are groaning right now.
You're in the majority there.
Yeah, I'm in the majority. So you can't see, sort of my network closet here. I've got a bunch of I've got 4 Raspberry Pi 4s in there. And so I run Arch Linux on those. I'm still a hardcore VI guy and a masochist, I think, to run Arch Linux. But yeah. And then, and scripting language. I'm still kind of an old school PHP guy. And that dates me. Maybe I should say Python. But yeah, I've written a lot of PHP in my day.
That's fantastic. So yeah, and speaking of Python, we really want to get Guido on this show. So anybody who I've written to him a couple of times, want to get him on the show. Anybody else? We're always accepting guests, so get in touch with us. Thanks so much for being on the show, Guy. It's been wonderful having you here. It's been a great hour, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, and good to see you, Simon. Good to see you, Doc.
Okay. Thanks. Wow, I can't make that shut up, that thing. Okay, so Simon, after I was interrupted I turned off my phone, but I didn't turn off my computer trying to be my phone while my watch was buzzing at me all at once. So Simon, how'd they go for you, man?
That was all very good. It was an opportunity to revisit past lives in many cases, and all the stuff that, all the leading questions that I was asking about standards and the clash of industries around open standards. That's all current reality for me in the work that I'm doing for OSI and standards bodies. So, Guy's in a great place there. This is a critical moment for open source to be engaging with open standards. But I have to give recognition at Oasis. Their general counsel at Oasis is a guy called Jamie Clark, and he did one of the cleverest things in open standards many years ago when he came up with an approach to handling intellectual property for Oasis that basically persuaded all of the vendors that open source was a much better approach than maintaining proprietary arsenals of software patents. And Oasis was the pioneer of that approach, and it's only just now beginning to settle into other standards bodies that's the right approach. So I think Guy's in a critical place there for us in the open source community, and I'm pleased that it's him and that he's there.
Yeah, that's those are all important things, and I think it's just really. I learned a lot in this show, which I didn't know, and that's always a great sign. So thanks again to Guy for that. And so Simon, anything you want to plug before we move on?
The days when I had anything to plug are long gone now. There's a Bijou and elite group of people who sponsor me on Patreon at patreon.com/webmink. There is one person sponsoring me on GitHub Sponsors, and my eternal thanks are his. And apart from that, I've really nothing to plug at the moment. There's a conference coming up for OSI called POSI, which is Practical Open Source Information. It's a completely free event. It's on September 16th, and people really should go and register. Go to opensource.org to find the on-ramp to doing that.
Oh, that's excellent. So if people please do that, and we'll stick that in our show summary. And I thank everybody for showing up. This has been a great show, and we will see you next week. And once again, I'm not looking at the schedule, so I don't remember who's on next week, but I'm sure it'll be great. So thank you so much. See you then.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? I am Ant Pruitt, and I want to tell you about my show, Hands on Photography, here on TWiT TV. Each and every week, Thursday that is, I like to sit down and share with you the best tips and tricks that are going to help make you a better photographer. And it's not always about Photoshop. It's not always about just having the biggest and baddest and bestest camera. It can be the simplest of things, like leave your eye open when you're looking through the viewfinder. All of these simple tips can really help step your photography game up. So subscribe to the show today. That's twit.tv/hop. And I look forward to talking to you soon.